Hey everybody, this is Jack Sholder, movie director, and I want to welcome you all to the Movie Raid Show.
It's time for the Movie Raid, and tonight's victim is director Jack Sholder, that has done many films such as A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Wishmaster 2, Alone in the Dark, The Hidden, and so many others. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Fantastic, man. Is there anything that you are currently working on, or any events that you want to do, anything that you are allowed to share at the moment, or are you just kicking back at the moment?
I do have a movie that I've been trying to get. We almost went into production a little while ago, and then things fell through, and so we're looking for another deal. So I hope that'll come together. Feel like I've got at least one more movie left in me, and I want to do one. So
do you have any writing projects as well? Any writing projects that you might be collaborating as well, or are you currently still writing anything as well?
Well, the movie that I'm trying to get going it's a vampire movie. I'm always interested in movies that are more than the genre. Vampire movies are very fertile ground for things that are about other things than vampires. What vampires represent, and metaphorically, and so on and so forth. So collaborated with a really talented writer, worked on the story and outlined the whole thing, and then he did all the hard work of actually writing it. And I would sit back and give him notes. If you're a painter and you feel like making a painting, you can just go out and paint. But if you're a movie director and you feel like making a movie, you got to come up with a lot of dough in order to do that. If you're a writer, the writer's lot in Hollywood can be a difficult one unless you're working on episodic, literally running the show. In feature films, I don't know, have you heard the joke about the Polish actress? I mean, I don't know if it's still politically correct, a Polish joke, and no disrespect to my Polish friends, the great culture. But anyway, the point of the joke is, you hear about the Polish actress? No. She slept with the writer. So I actually decided, some people had approached me about writing an autobiography. I have very little interest in writing an autobiography, and I have a feeling that most people have very little interest in reading my autobiography. There was something that kind of intrigued me, that little story that had to do with my life, a lot in my life, planning to be a writer. That was what I was going to do before I got interested. I've actually been writing this little story, which has been kind of fun. A week ago, somebody said, hey, one of the big channels, genre services, is running a film festival in LA, and they asked me if I'd be on the jury, and I said, sure. And then it turned out that they wanted to get a bunch of the people from Elm Street to be on the jury. And then they said, hey, maybe we should get you all out and have a panel. Well, that would be a lot of fun. Some of these people I haven't seen in quite a while. So, those are the kind of things that are kind of happening these days. And I'm taking it easy a lot.
Today is always rapid on technology, and as far as film directing as well. And today, if a film director chooses their own script that they wrote on themselves, or even having to put a part on even co-writing, do you think that if a self-director uses their screenplay, it can actually delay time away on other things in creating the film for that, and even take less story if there is even like a constant rewrites or any other changes involved with that?
Once I started directing, it was like, gee, let the other guys sit there and stare at a blank page. With me and the way my career went, I usually got hired to direct something when it was kind of ready to go. They're ready to make it. If you write a script, you sit around and you spend years trying to sell it or trying to get it made, and sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, and it can be extremely draining, frustrating. I've spared that to a large extent. I mean, it's also like editing. I mean, I started out, I was always planning to be a director, but I kind of fell into editing as a kind of a day gig, and I was really good at it. But when I started to direct, I hired an editor, which isn't to say that I directed the movie and then I walked away and said, okay, edit the movie and, call me when it's all done. Supervised it very closely, but the actual dog work of editing I didn't do, and that's kind of how it works. Some directors now, very few. The Coen brothers are one example who actually do edit their own. In a way, I wouldn't mind editing because I like it and I'm good at it. But I kind of wanted to get another perspective, because when I shoot it, I pretty much know exactly what I want, and because of my editing background, as I'm shooting it's sort of cutting together in my head, so I kind of know what it's going to look like when it's edited. So it's nice to have somebody who doesn't have that picture in their head, who can then come to it a more neutral perspective.
Do you feel the more content a screenplay has, the more you have to kind of balance it out and due to the budget, but not just adjust the balance of the budget, but also to the content itself, in compliance as to that balance of that budget between the directing and the screenplay itself?
Studio or network. I worked for studios. I worked for HBO. I directed a Showtime movie. Did the pilot for NBC. A bunch of stuff like. They knew what in for. So there was a budget that they felt was sufficient to make the movie that they wanted to make. So if I were to come on and say, can't make it for this budget, then they'd say, okay, to my agent, well, who else you got? That's usually not an issue. I mean, the issue is that once you agree to the budget, then you as the director are responsible for bringing it in on that budget. And that can be pretty stressful sometimes. And
what are really the high risks when it comes to, let's say you barely make it to that budget, but let's say if you go over it, or let's say, going under budget doesn't seem so bad, but at the same time, you're kind of losing out on adding something else to that. But what happens if, what are the risks when it comes to even going over it, or let's say you can't meet that budget per se from the studio itself?
You're in deep shit, because you actually have a contract where you, in the contract, say, I'm gonna make this movie for this budget. So you're responsible. That's part of the job description. I was involved in one film, and it was actually the first Marvel comic book thing, and I actually did it for Fox Television. It was called Generation X. It was the Junior X-Men. It was not your run-of-the-mill TV movie. It was quite complicated, and in order to do it within the budget that they wanted, and the company had been taken over by a businessman who said, we're not going over budget on our films anymore. That's not happening. And of course, that always happens. That's part of the way most feature films go over budget. And he said that's not happening. And the guys who were running the company said, if you go over budget, we're going to lose our job. So you can't go over budget. We were shooting up in Vancouver, and it was a really complicated shoot. And there were a few days that I just thought it was impossible to make those days. That there was just too much to do, and it just couldn't be done. And I made the mistake, one of the heads of production came up. I made the mistake of telling him that. I just should have, kept my mouth shut. But I told him that, and he kind of freaked out and went back to the line producer. The line producer is the guy who's actually in charge of, running the thing, day to day, and, being in charge of the budget and all that, and they said, hey, what's going on here? You got a director, and he claims that the budget is no good and they can't make it for that budget, and that's the budget that we have, and what are we going to do here? And so it raised a lot of shit, and it created a lot of pressure for me. So it turned out not to be a good situation. I just should have said, yeah, absolutely, and then if we went over budget, then we deal with it then. So part of the deal.
Now, you've been involved with so many different sequels and various TV shows, or even TV movie based. But when it comes to creating sequels or being a part of it, do you feel that it's actually hard to direct a sequel when oftentimes it's not exactly going to sell all the time? But how do you formulate an actual good original sequel? Is it the script, or do you think it's mainly in part for the director?
It's the script. In American movies, in Europe, believe that it's all the director, and the director is king. If the director wants to, take the script for a drama and, turn it into put a bunch of dance numbers into it, they say, well, okay, he's exercising exercising his genius creativity. But here in America, really, story is really, what it's all about. I mean, that's one of the things that characterizes American movies. They have strong scripts. European filmmakers have told me, places like Germany, there's a lot of state sponsorship. You're not really beholden to anyone. You don't have that discipline of having to bring it in on budget or have the film make money. If it makes too much money, maybe it's not artistic enough. Who knows? It all starts from the script. As a director, basically a movie's kind of like it's kind of like a crime scene, in the sense that the movie is the crime, in a sense, and you're the detective. So you got to look at the script. So if you're a detective and you walk into a room and there's a dead body with a knife sticking out of its back, and you're the detective, you say, I think somebody's been murdered here. You're not a very good detective, but you're going to go and you're going to look for clues under the bed and pull out drawers and dust for fingerprints on the windows and do all that, and go over the thing with a fine-tooth comb and say, how did this happen? Gee, the bullet came through this window, and he was obviously sitting in the chair, and it came from this angle, so the shooter must have been blah blah blah. And that's kind of how you have to approach the script. What is the story about? If you don't deeply understand what that story is, then you can't tell it. I mean, your job is to tell that story, and it starts with the script. If I read the script and it doesn't do anything for me, I'm not going to make a good movie. And so, I'll say, well, let's see what else you got. But this is not for me. Part of the reason is because, if I don't think it's a good script, I know I'm not going to make a good movie. I have no chance of making a good movie. If it's a good script, then I have a chance to make a good movie. I mean, it doesn't guarantee it. I could fuck the whole thing up, but at least it means that I got a chance here. So that's kind of how it works for me. As a director, part of what I do is I work on script. I mean, part of insist on, I guess they kind of expect it, is that I'm going to take that script and do what my agent used to call directing on the page. What's the story? What does this mean? What's the meaning of this story? What am I trying to get across here? It's not just, hey, he beats up his wife and then he jumps out the window. Well, why did he beat up his wife? Well, I mean, you could say, well, he beat up his wife because she pissed him off. But, why did she piss him off? You keep asking questions. And then you start to understand why things are happening. And maybe the writer didn't quite make that clear, and so you have to go back and make it more clear. Maybe you have to add something to show why this would happen, so on and so on. So those the kind of things that you do. So I always work on the story. I mean, with Elm Street, I got hired. I replaced Wes Craven because Wes dropped out. I had to take over the movie. Basically, the train was rolling down the track. I mean, they had a start date and they were already prepping the movie and all the rest of that. So I didn't have the studio liked the script. My job was to just put it on film. So that was one where I didn't have a lot of input. It was just like, well, how can I make a good movie, and how can I get through the shoot without losing my mind? It's not easy.
Do you feel like characterization is always, even with the time that you were directing with those films, was actually monopolized by Hollywood with their constant content changing and direction to their audience as well, and just focusing on just selling the product? Do you think that from then, even today, they still monopolize like that?
It is a business. They don't call it show business. Call it show business because it's a business. If the studio loses money, people lose their jobs. If they hire me, how is this going to make money? My job is to make the best film that I can possibly make.
A successful director always has their hits and misses, regardless of working on the film or even after the film. Sometimes the film just bombs for whatever reason, whatever is inventive that to the audience or whatever to the public. When it comes to films, do you think that at some point that that director may have to rely on just the credibility rather than the accountability. Do you think that the studio chooses to write with them as well when it comes to them being involved with the bomb film or films?
I mean, there are certain people that can get away with a bomb or two. If you're Steven Spielberg and the film doesn't make money, they're still going to want to be in business with you because you've made a lot of movies that have made money, and they figure that you'll make more. And sometimes there might be something that Spielberg wants to do that's maybe not the most commercial. They want to be in business with him, so they'll say, "Well, okay, make it, and maybe it'll catch on." There are certain movies that get made that people think are not going to do particularly well that end up, being blockbusters. So there's a book by William Goldman. At one point, he was the highest paid screenwriter in Hollywood. He wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and he also wrote plays and novels, and he was a major character. But he wrote a book called Adventures in the Screen Trade. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend that you read it. First of all, it's extremely entertaining. I mean, he's a very, very entertaining writer. So it's a really great, fun read. One of the things that he says that's kind of like a famous quote from the book within nobody knows anything. Nobody can really predict what movie's going to make money. If they could, a lot of movies wouldn't get made, and a lot of other movies that got made by somebody else them instead. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about all these huge hit movies that studios turned down. People say, I actually turned down Titanic, or I turned down this or turned down that, So, yeah, nobody knows.
And studios are always reformatting everything, even with television and restructuring and whatnot. But how can a director basically stay, actually relevant, not just relevant, but also adaptive in the constant changing of today's filmmaking? Do you feel that they have to wear multiple hats in order to stay within the change of the industry, not just purely stay in as a director or as this, or even as an actor? Do they have to be multiple places in order to get where they need to go in their career?
The business has changed enormously since I left Hollywood. I mean, with streaming and, it's a whole other business. I mean, it's very, very different than it was. I mean, on a certain level, it's the same. You're telling stories, hoping that people will be interested in hearing that story or watching that story. But the whole way that the industry works with streaming, and I don't know, it's a completely different world than the world that I worked in. People talk to me about it to a certain extent, but I really don't know. I'm completely out of that whole scene.
Was it really more of a challenging effort for you, not just working with one studio, or at least multiple big studios? Because again, this was Hollywood and whatnot, but was it more of a challenge then as you progressed until to the point where you left Hollywood? And did it at some point have more clarification for you, making the work a little bit less pressure because of Hollywood?
Hollywood is Hollywood. They call it the Dream Factory for good reason. I hadn't been out there in a bunch of years, and they were doing a restoration of all of the Nightmare films, formatting them, restoring them, going back to the original negative and putting them into 4K. And also taking the original mixes. I mean, we had mixed the film. New Line didn't have a lot of money back then. We mixed the film in mono because they didn't want to spend the extra money for stereo. They put the film into Dolby Atmos, and it was incredible. I mean, the way the movie sounded. I mean, it kind of sounded the way it sounded in the mixing studio, but it was never going to sound like that in the real world back, in those days, because you had an optical track, which was, a very imperfect medium. But anyway, I hadn't been out there in a long time, and they put me up in a hotel that was in Burbank, not far from the Warner Brothers studio, which is one of the iconic studios. If you think of a movie studio, this is kind of like, the image that might come to mind. I got in at night, and then I had to go to the studio the next morning to look at the work that had been done. And as I was driving down this boulevard, and I could see Warner Brothers, and I could see that famous water tower with the WB logo on it, and I got a thrill, and I thought, wow, I had an office there for a little bit, but I hadn't been there in a long time, and it was like, wow, this is the movies, this is what it's all about. Unfortunately, the Hollywood is, for people working in the business, it's a very, very rough time now. People are having a hard time, which, a lot of people are really struggling to make a living because so much work is going out of town. Although I actually did a lot of films. It seemed like the first 10 years that I worked in Hollywood, most of the stuff I shot was shot in LA, and then it seemed like the second 10 years or so, it seemed like almost everything I did was out of town. As far as the director goes, it really doesn't matter, but, if you're the person building sets or, any of that, and they go out of town, well, you can't work on that. That's a movie that you're not working on.
Now, working as a director between then on the films that you did work on, do you feel like, as far as the creative independence, was the creative independence different for you then in comparison to some of the films that you're currently working on right now? What kind of direction, what were you allowed, and were you even limited in comparison between then and now?
Honestly, I never felt particularly constrained. It might have been me, that I was just sort of ornery and just was going to do what I wanted to do, and maybe if I'd been a little more compliant, I would have worked more. I mean, people will tell you, once the movie starts shooting, other than firing the director, there's not a whole lot you can do. The director's going to direct it. The director wants it to go. I did a couple of sequels. Obviously I did the, Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I never felt any pressure. I mean, New Line really, at that point, they didn't fully understand how the series worked. Once they saw how people reacted to Elm Street 2 and to Robert Englund, to Freddy, then they sort of understood that, here's how the film needs to work. But I mean, with me, they didn't. And I thought, hey, I'm going to make a better movie than Wes did. That was my attitude. The only thing they ever told me was keep Freddy dark. Keep him scary. That was it. So, whereas, if you're doing probably a Marvel franchise or something like that, where they've got hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, and they think that they understand how these things work, there might be a lot more oversight to make sure that you're doing it the way they think it ought to be done.
Was there also limited creative independence because you yourself have a hand in the editing process? You like say you work between like Wishmaster 2 and Nightmare on Elm Street 2, and you're pretty much everywhere at that time, and these were two different budgeted films. Was creative independence, was that also different for you when doing the editing process too?
The way the editing process works is the director, according to the Directors Guild, what the Directors Guild has negotiated for its members is creative rights. Creative rights is enormously important issue for the members. When I did Elm Street, I wasn't in the guild, so I wasn't protected by that, but I had a long-term relationship with New Line. They knew that I was a good editor, and they left me alone to make my cut. I mean, there are instances where they'll try to get involved in the process before the directors had a chance. I mean, the way that it works, when they say, oh, it took 6 months to edit the film, or 9 months to edit the film, the film, basically, the editor is cutting the scenes as they're shot. So if I shoot scene 23 tomorrow or the next day, he's going to cut scene 33. And it's called a, quote, rough cut. But it's not rough at all. The editor is going to try to cut it as best as he possibly can, but it's being cut out of context. And so a week or not much more, the whole film has been cut together. All the scenes have been edited, and edited as well as the editor can edit them. And then you put the whole thing together and you look at it and say, holy shit, we're in trouble here. It doesn't work. It never works because somehow in the process, things change. The script was great. The performances were great. The camera work looked beautiful. You watch the movie and the story just doesn't work. And then that's when the next 6 months of editing happen. The producers look at the cut editor has completed for the director. They're going to look and say, oh my God, this thing has got terrible problems. What are we going to do? Whereas as the director, you look at it and say, well, part of your job is learning how to structure a film and learning, how to get it to work. Directors have, and that's part of what they do. And so if the studio or somebody tries to look at the film before you've had a chance to really work on it, it can kind of freak them out. And so I've been fortunate because a lot of times, the studio or the producers or whomever, they want to see that first cut. And I've fought to not have them see that cut. Sometimes it's been a real battle, but for some reason I've been fortunate enough that I've won that battle every time. So as far as I know, no one has seen those cuts before I've had a chance to really work on them. And I should say that the relationship between the director and the editor is a very, very close one. And, speaking as someone, who worked as an editor, just as a matter of honor, you're working for the director. If the studio comes in and says, hey, we want to see this. You would say, no, I'm not allowed to let you see this without the director's permission. They say, well, you don't have to let him know. And then I can't do that. That's the kind of relationship that exists, and your job is to protect the director and be loyal to them. It's a very, very strong bond there.
And New Line also was, in that moment was, they were a giant when it came to like A Nightmare on Elm Street. And there was always multiple different people working on the whole saga. Was the relationship working within New Line? Did it actually help benefit you to a certain degree? Because oftentimes everybody wants to get a good amount of money for the craft that they are paid to do. But when it came to regional stuff, when it comes outside the company or outside the region, did that affect you in any way, regardless if the film succeeded or didn't succeed?
My job was to deliver the movie, and then it was their job to sell it. I had met the guy who started New Line, Bob Shea, when the company was just getting started and when I was just getting started. And he and I hit it off and we became very, very close friends. I mean, practically like family. And so he knew me very well and he trusted me. I had done I edited a lot of trailers for the company. And in fact, that's how we initially met. So there was a lot of trust involved. Go and do some research and read some stories about the production of the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, they ran out of money. I mean, they were not a big studio at that point. They were sort of living hand to mouth to a certain extent. And, they literally risked everything to make that movie because they believed in it. And then it turned out to be enormous success. But it was kind of really touch and go. I mean, by the time they got to the sequel, because the original one had been such a success, they were pretty sure that the sequel was going to make money. They didn't think it was going to make as much money as the original, honestly. They told me if the movie made 80% of what the original made, they would have been very happy. I mean, this is before the days of where everybody was doing sequels like they are now. And you expect the sequel to be bigger and better than the original. But at that point, it was basically just a chance of like squeezing some more cash out of the original.
You yourself said in the past that horror wasn't exactly your main favorite genre to work in per se, but
no.
Having to be hired to do something that isn't exactly either your comfort zone or just simply something that you just wasn't what can it really affect a director, personal choice versus professionalism between then even now of today's filmmaking? I
never set out to be a horror filmmaker. I mean, actually, if you look at the films that I've made, there are more of them that aren't horror films than are horror films, seem to be known for. When Wes dropped out of Elm Street 2, and they called me and said, we'd like you to direct the movie. My first reaction was I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do a sequel to somebody else's horror movie, you know. A friend of mine who was already working in Hollywood said, hey, Jack, don't be an idiot. You know, the movie's going to make a lot of money, and you'll have a career as a director. And he was right. The movie made a lot of money the first weekend, and the phone started ringing, and next thing I knew, I was in L.A. I was lucky. I mean, well, these days, anybody can direct a movie because, you know, you can go out with your iPhone and shoot a movie. You know, you don't need a lot of money. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. You don't need very much to make a movie, you know. And if you've got a really good story and you've got good actors who can make it believable, it doesn't matter if it looks polished or not. It's all about the story. It's a different bar than it was back then. And there are an awful lot of genre filmmakers, you know, who are making these low budget horror movies, because horror movies are pretty inexpensive to make as a rule. I mean, you know, depending on what you want to do with the special effects budget. You know, a lot of people think that the movie's all about the special effects, but it's really not. It's really about the characters. You know, some of these people make, you know, very, very good films, but they don't get the recognition. You know, I was lucky that I happened to get asked to make the sequel to, you know, a famous series, you know, I just got that opportunity and, you know, I made the most of it.
And you had to, you know, not necessarily, well, pick up the pieces or anything, because there probably weren't pieces to be broken to begin with, but when you have to take over from previously from another director's point of view, how has that mentality and process worked out for you? Like when you have to be hired to take over at a certain area or areas of an existing property, was that a little bit more difficult and challenging rather than just having, going through the original script that you already were hired to do on a different film?
It's different. I mean, oddly enough, I've actually done it several times. I got hired to take over a film from another director. I mean, my attitude was that I could make it better. That was my intention.
Now, do you feel today, when it comes to studios, do you feel like they have industrialized the market and film committees so much that it actually is currently possibly limiting even the independent artists or even financially harming directors, including writers, like to minimize costs to creating a film of today's filmmaking? You
know, people have referred to Hollywood as a film factory. Back in the old days, you know, when all the movies were made by the studios, you know, they had a whole system for cranking it out. And honestly, you know, what I was talking about in terms of creative rights of the film director, you know, basically you shot the film and then the studio edited it. Unless you were, you know, a highly successful director with a lot of clout, you know, then you could be involved with the editing. But, you know, otherwise, and I mean, that's kind of the way television, the Directors Guild has negotiated that the director is entitled a cut of the episode that they shot. And I always took that very seriously. I couldn't wait to get into the editing room, but the editor said, gee, you know, you're one of the few directors that's really come in and worked on their cut. You know, most of them, you know, they just have sort of accepted that the way that it goes is your job's over, you know, once you finish shooting. The fact is you can go in there and you can say, you know, I want to do this and I want to do that, and then they have to let you do that, and then when they're done, they can go and do whatever the hell they want. Anyway, you know, that's their right. So it's no different than it's always been. The thing is that if you're making your own movie with your own money or with your, you know, your dentist's money or your parents' money or whatever, you know, then you have the creative freedom, you know. But then the problem is getting your film shown. I've heard people call that the other 50%. You know, what you think, gee, it's really hard to raise the money, but, you know, the other part is to get distribution and have people actually be able to watch the movie.
Go ahead and plug in any websites or any other events, or even plug in your films, or any other added advice that you care to give to filmmakers today in a different world of the digitalized filmmaking world.
People have been telling stories since the Greeks, you know, and learn how to tell a good story. You probably know people who can't tell a joke. You know, are there people you know who they just like, if they try to tell a joke, they kind of mess it up? You know what I mean? There's an art to telling a joke well, you know, and comedians, you know, who are kind of crazy, you know, weird misfit kind of people. They work their asses off to, you know, find just the right word and just the right timing and just the, you know, it's not like they just sort of walk on stage and rattle out a joke. They've been working and working and working on it. And maybe, you know, guys, you know, well-known comedians, you know, Seinfeld, who's worth, you know, tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars. He'll take his work out on the road, test it, and see what's working and what isn't, and then, you know, adjust and put himself through that process. The material. So there's really a craft to it. It's just not about going out and shooting a lot of blood. If you know, if you're doing a genre movie, there's got to be a point. There's a subtext. You know, what is this film really about? What is it saying? Why? You know, what's the point? Who is this scene about? Who's the movie about? You really have to think about it. Like I said, it's like a crime scene. You know, you have to investigate every little part of it, so you fully understand it, so you can tell that story as well as possible. You know, one of the things, you know, having taught now, you know, I tell my students, you have to be the world's greatest authority on that story. You know, that's what gives you your power as a director, that you just understand that story better than anyone else in the world. If you walk on a film set where there's a good director, they're usually sitting with their head buried in the script. You know, what the job is to tell that story. So that's really what it's all about. So that would be my advice.
There you have it, everybody. That is director Jack Sholder.